This little guy is a northern Mexican garter snake. They are a harmless, non-venomous species of snake that is federally protected by the Endangered Species Act, and they are just one of many protected endangered species that live in one of the most biodiverse regions in the US. There are frogs, rattlesnakes, and even furry critters like jaguars, ocelots, and bears, if you're into that sort of thing, that rely on the unique habitat that exists through Arizona's southern border with Mexico. This is largely due to a chain of mountains that form a natural corridor for wildlife. These mountains are referred to as the Sky Islands because they tower above the surrounding desert valleys and connect the semi-tropical environment of Mexico to the more temperate forests and grasslands in the US. For species like Arizona's ridge-nosed rattlesnake, these mountains act like literal islands of inhabitable terrain that these snakes have specifically adapted to live on. For more migratory species like jaguars, these mountains represent a narrow corridor needed for seasonal migration. Famously, a jaguar named El Jefe was witnessed from 2012 to 2015 in the Santa Rita's mountain range in Arizona. That's right, we have jaguars in Arizona. After the 2015 sighting, El Jefe was not seen again for another 6 years. Then last year in November, El Jefe finally made an appearance on a trail cam in Sonora, Mexico, operated by the Pro Fauna Borderlands Linkage Initiative. No word on if any of these trail cams have caught Bigfoot yet, but I guess a jaguar is pretty cool too. This was incredibly exciting and is proof that even with all the challenges wildlife face, that endangered species that rely on this fragile and limited habitat and migration zone are still out there finding a way to survive in this precious mountain oasis in the desert. Well, that doesn't look good. Unfortunately for this snake and all the other endangered species that call this zone home, they have very bad internet reception and likely missed this late November alert. On November 30th of 2022, the US Forest Service issued an alert telling people to avoid this section of the Coronado National Forest due to an illegal construction project guarded by unauthorized armed personnel. Now, if you don't already know what I'm talking about, this probably sounds pretty crazy, and you might be wondering why nothing has been done to stop this construction project from further damaging this important habitat. Well, it's not much of a mystery. It's the same thing that stops most things from getting fixed in America. Politics. Now, before you click off this video, I want to stress that I'm going to do my best to just lay out the facts of this particular situation. That is admittedly hard to do with an issue as politicized as this, but I'm still going to try to just lay out all the facts I could find so you can form your own opinion and hopefully understand this bizarre situation that I'm honestly surprised has not been talked about more. And finally, I also want to highlight the efforts of some real-life heroes that have for the time being succeeded where the US Forest Service and the Department of Justice failed in protecting this habitat. Now, unless you live under a rock, which could be an advantage in our coming climate apocalypse, you have likely heard arguments for building a wall along America's southern border with Mexico. These arguments usually revolve around stopping illegal immigration, the flow of illegal drugs, and the ongoing crisis of refugees seeking asylum in the US. The problem is, most illegal immigrants are not sneaking over the border. They are coming into the country through legal entry points and then overstay their visa. This is a problem, but not one that building a wall through protected habitat will fix. As for the flow of narcotics and other items entering the country, stats from the DEA and US Customs and Border Patrol claim that between 80 and 90% of most contraband are smuggled through legal ports of entry and transported on major highways and are not being carried through the desert by migrants and asylum seekers, which, in the interest of being fair, like, how do they know 100% of the total trade? Especially when tunnels are found and we have no way of really knowing how much was moved through them. So saying 80 to 90% of contraband was seized at legal ports of entry seems a little meaningless. It's a little bit like saying we found most of the contraband where we looked for it the most. Yeah, that's how that's gonna usually work. But even with these, in my opinion, weak stats, there's a reason to assume there are not huge amounts, if any, drugs being smuggled by your average immigrant or refugee. As I said earlier, when you hear references to illegal immigration, it is mostly referring to people who entered the country legally, then overstayed their visa. So these people have already been vetted and have already been screened for contraband when they first enter the country. Think border checkpoints and airport security. How harmful or helpful this is to the US is above my pay grade to understand or try to explain here, but I do feel confident in saying that building an extra chunk of wall through critical habitat will not stop immigrants from overstaying their visas or do anything to catch smuggled goods statistically more likely to be coming through legal ports of entry in the first place. Finally, the last and most trendy reason to cite for this extension of the border wall is the quote, refugee crisis. It is important for a country to have full control or at least knowledge of who is entering its borders, and there has been much fear drummed up around the fact that the US is seeing an unprecedented number of refugees seeking asylum. It is also true that there are more people around the world than ever before being forced to flee their home.
Look at this. This was Sunday night in El Paso, an enormous migrant caravan of well over 1,000 people crossed into El Paso last night. Media reporting it is potentially the biggest mass crossing in the city's history.
Just recently, the UNHCR publicized the recent milestone of there being over 100 million refugees globally. This means that for the first time in recorded human history, 1 out of every 78 people on Earth has had to flee their home for safety and are currently refugees. These numbers are staggering and heartbreaking, but it becomes easy to imagine how taking in the increase of refugees could lead to problems in the US. One problem though, the US has actually been continuing a 40-year trend in reducing the number of refugees it is willing to accept. This means at a time where more people than ever before are searching for a safe place to move their life, the door admitting entry to the US is smaller than ever before. So yeah, the line at the door is going to get bigger and harder to manage, but the answer is not making the door smaller. The best analogy I can think of for discussing this refugee crisis is, instead of imagining people trying to enter a country, imagine masses of people trying to flee a burning building. Chances are they didn't want to leave, they certainly didn't have time to bring all their possessions with them, and they aren't taking the time to coordinate drug deals while they're fleeing for their lives.
Do not sell marijuana to my husband.
Okay.
I mean it.
Now imagine there being more people in the burning building than ever before, while the exit has been slowly shrinking for the last 40 years. Shrinking the door makes escaping the burning building much less efficient, but when the alternative is literally death, people are going to try to squeeze through any crack to safety they can find. Furthermore, just as one doesn't exit a burning building and call it a night, they get rescued by firefighters and EMTs that will make sure they are okay. Refugees don't just enter the country, but are often conflated with being the same as illegal immigrants, but that is not the case. Refugees enter the country with the intention of turning themselves over to Customs and Border Patrol.
Of hundreds of these migrants just walking across the river and then gathering on the U.S. side of the river. They form a single file line.
To follow the analogy, Customs should act like the first responders and help people fleeing their respective burning buildings. So to clarify, refugees are not breaking the law by showing up at the southern border. They are following the legal process of applying for asylum, so it should go without saying if a refugee shows up hoping to apply for asylum, they are not going to be traveling with contraband that will instantly get them branded as a trafficker and not a refugee. And it follows that if someone was designated as a refugee, they were not smuggling contraband and were never going to try to sneak across the border to begin with. By definition, refugees are coming here with the intention of being rescued or caught, so extending the wall will do as much to stop refugees from showing up as shrinking the door on a burning building will do to stop occupants from trying to escape. Oh yeah, and I thought the other arguments were more foundationally important to address, but also this illegal emergency wall is being constructed out of storage containers, which I can only assume are inhospitable and impossible to cut through structures.
Driving the popularity of container homes.
Alrighty, so here we have all the tools that we use to cut the container.
The idea that every part of this box is structural is false. Every single cut that you make for plumbing, windows, doors, compromises its strength.
So with all the reasons why this wall won't solve the problems it is supposed to solve laid out, let's look at some of the problems it will cause. I started this video with a brief description of how ecologically important the Sky Islands and surrounding grasslands are. When people think of the border between the US and Mexico, they often think of vast desolate desert, and that does describe some portions of the border, and a wall already exists through much of these areas. Many of the proposed new sections of wall are meant to fill gaps in the areas the US seem to have a sufficient natural border, like mountains for instance. The reason it was thought that a wall over these natural borders was unnecessary is if someone's going to take the preparations to successfully cross an entire mountain range, a wall won't stop them because, let me double check my notes here, mountains are bigger than walls. Oh yeah, right. While these mountains have historically been a strong barrier against humans crossing borders, these mountains do the exact opposite for animals that use them as migratory highways, providing them a safe route to travel, as well as a comparatively more hospitable environment to seasonally inhabit. According to Emily Burns, a biologist and the Conservation Program Director for the Sky Island Alliance, endangered jaguars, ocelots, mountain lions, quadrumundi, mule deer, bears, and javelinas in this area all need to be able to move to survive. If they can't move, these animals will disappear from these ranges. The problem is, borders are made up. The animals that live in North America evolved and adapted to very specific ways of life on this continent long before it was carved up into Canada, the US, and Mexico. We can't expect to put hard barriers through habitats that have been around much longer than the countries constructing said barriers and expect it not to have an effect on wildlife. They deserve better. I mean, could you even imagine if this was being done to people, just erecting a wall down the middle of a community that has existed for hundreds of years, and then just telling them they can't access half of their land anymore?
But the wall proposal has also divided a different nation, the Tohono O'odham Nation in Arizona.
It will have to get through the Tohono O'odham Nation and their land. It's an area roughly the size of the state of Connecticut. Verlin Jose is the vice chairman of the Tohono O'odham Nation.
To put a border wall here, it would be detrimental to our people.
It would have a psychological effect. It would have an emotional effect. I think you wouldn't like it if I built a wall right through your home.
Oh yeah. At the beginning of this video, I set out to make this as apolitical as possible, but that doesn't mean there isn't a right or wrong stance on this. I have laid out a multitude of reasons why the wall won't solve its stated goals and will negatively affect people and wildlife in the path of its construction. Despite my obviously having a strong stance on this, I believe I succeeded in keeping it apolitical. Until now. Although both major parties in the US speak very differently about extending the wall on the southern border, their actions have largely been the same. The only real difference is Republicans tend to run on promising to build the wall to keep the country safe and then build the wall once they're in office, while Democrats like Joe Biden run on,
"There will not be another foot of wall constructed in my administration,"
only to justify continued wall construction once in office as being for migrant safety. So whatever side of the political aisle you most closely identify with, it really doesn't matter. Republicans in power are excitedly pro-wall, and Democrats in power are reluctantly or even secretly pro-wall. At the end of the day, both sides of this issue have utterly failed to protect our country, refugees, or wildlife, which is discouraging, but there are heroes in this story. In early October, Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, no, not him, initially announced another section of storage container wall in addition to the small section of shipping container wall installed in Yuma earlier this year. This new addition through Cochise County is much larger and will cost an estimated $95 million to cover only 10 miles, which sounds crazy, but it gets worse. Arizona was already asked to remove the shipping containers in Yuma because they are now in the way of workers the federal government contracted to finish the wall in that section. So now Arizona's shipping container wall is literally in the way of the federal government finishing their wall, and instead of Arizona removing the $10 million unauthorized wall in Yuma that trespassed on tribal and federal land, Ducey decided to sue the federal government on October 21st and continued with doubling down on a $95 million 10-mile extension of the border fence through Cochise County and the Huachuca Mountains. Then on November 23rd, the Department of Justice asked the court to dismiss Doug Ducey's lawsuit because, quote, it had no basis in fact or law and the shipping container construction was unlawful. How did Arizona respond? Well, we chugged right along with the project until protesters began to literally stand in their way and peacefully block containers.
Harity was part of a small group which sat next to the containers.
We're sort of recreating intentionally in a place. What we're here to do is enjoy our public lands in a strategic way that hinders the placement of further shipping containers.
This succeeded in halting progress for a few days until construction crews began to work at night to avoid protesters, to which the protesters shrugged and went home because they did all they could do. No, who do you think they are? The DOJ? These are protesters and biologists that actually care about stopping this project before it's completed. So they began camping in construction areas, and on December 7th at 3 a.m., construction was officially halted. I want to highlight and thank the protesters for this because if it were not for them, the project would have done much more damage and been much further along by December 14th, a week later when the DOJ finally filed suit against Arizona for continuing the border wall they were told to remove all the way back in October. Stopping the construction for a full week before the DOJ took legal action is a huge win. The 130 shipping container unit wall in Yuma took only 11 days to install, so every minute the protesters stalled the Cochise County project before December 7th and the full week they halted construction before the DOJ stepped back in on December 14th has resulted in miles of vital habitat being saved. But these protesters can't camp out forever, so what will happen here in the long term? Well, it seems that Doug Ducey may be standing down after the DOJ's lawsuit against Arizona, as it demanded that Arizona remove the shipping containers and pay damages to undue harm that was caused by the illegal placement of shipping containers on federal land. Mind you, it costs $95 million just to purchase and bring these containers to the border, so removing them and undoing the damage that was done by the wall's hasty construction is likely to also come with a nasty price tag and just generally is going to be a pain to fix. And Doug Ducey has less than a month left in his term as governor. At best, this wall seems like a sad and ill-conceived last-ditch effort of securing a meaningful legacy before stepping down as governor. At worst, it was just a political stunt that resulted in miles of habitat destruction and millions of wasted Arizona tax dollars. But there is a bright side. Ducey is out as governor and Katie Hobbs is in, and she is a Democrat and has spoken against this wall in the past, so she will definitely remove the shipping containers and restore— No! If you believe that, you haven't been paying attention. This really isn't a political issue that just goes away when Democrats are in office. It just gets done quieter for reasons that sound nicer. So we will have to pay close attention to what actually happens when Hobbs takes office in January. The DOJ's suit will likely force the removal of these shipping containers, which I only hope will be done in a way that doesn't further scar the land, but that doesn't doesn't mean a nicer version of the border fence with the same negative effects on wildlife won't just get put in its place. Just last month, not another foot of wall Joe Biden began preparations for continuing a Trump-era section of border wall through the Pajarito Mountains, which is also critical habitat for endangered species and a primary route for jaguars through Arizona. In short, this is very much an ongoing issue that anyone who cares about conservation needs to keep a close eye on and hold our elected officials accountable for. The good news is, the protesters that stalled Ducey's stunt to the point of canceling it completely just showed us how effective peaceful direct action can be, and this is a definite win for the animals that call the Huachucas and the surrounding grasslands home. The environmental argument against the southern border wall is perhaps one of the most overlooked major ecological threats posed by our own government on our wildlife. More people need to know about this issue because next time it comes up, it will probably take more than a small group of protesters to halt wall construction if it is being placed by the federal government and state in tandem. This time around, the protesters literally had the federal government on their side because they were protesting an illegal construction project. But what happens when the section of wall signed off on by Biden goes up in the Pajarito Mountains? Protesters will not as easily be able to shut down construction without facing much steeper legal consequences for impeding what will be considered a legal construction project. That is why I think the best thing we can do is try to counter the arguments for the wall, make it clear to people how the wall does not solve any of the problems that it is supposed to solve, while introducing all sorts of new challenges for already endangered species, not to mention communities that have existed along the border since long before there ever was a border.
We've never crossed the border crossed us.
The only way we stop this frivolous and harmful wall in the long term is if we make it so politically unpopular to build another foot of it that no politician would dare try it. So spread the word, share this video, share the Nat Geo article I linked below this video alongside my other sources, and follow Sky Island Alliance on Instagram. They were a great source of information for this video and were the group that inspired me to create this video. So if you liked this video, go give them support. They're doing the real on-the-ground work to protect this important region, and on top of getting to stay up to date on this issue, they also throw in some cute trail cam footage of animals from time to time, and who doesn't love that? Still waiting on a Bigfoot picture though. Anyway, thank you for watching this week's video. If you're still here, I hope that you enjoyed it or at least learned something and didn't just finish the video because you're still typing your hate comment. I would also like to thank my amazing patrons that support this dying channel and make videos like this possible, starting with my head herpers, Allie Ward, Amanda Lynn, Bobby Cromer, Deborah Torgerson, JCH, Lavenders, Lindsay Justice, Sierra Sicard, Tiffany H, and my two newest head herpers, Liz Dillinger and Wyatt Gilbert. Thank you for joining after last week's video, it really means a lot. And I would also like to thank the members of all my other patron tiers that help me keep the channel going. You all rock, and I am very grateful for your support. Anyway, thanks again for watching this week's video. If you like this one and haven't seen my video on the problem with fake turtle rescues on YouTube, you can check out that video here. And with that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. I hope none of you start an illegal construction project on federally protected land, but most of all, I hope that you just keep herping.